Short row shaping or partial knitting utilizes a carriage function called hold. On a brother style machine, there's an NH lever in the bottom left hand corner of the carriage itself. N will knit normally, and H will hold needles or ignore needles that are brought out into hold position. It's a useful method of free passing the carriage. So here you can see I pulled all the needles to hold. When I knit across, the needles don't move. The carriage ignores them, and it simply lays a float across the needles that are pulled out into hold. So I can slip back in the other direction. I haven't added any rows. Nothing's knitted. I've just been able to free pass the carriage back and forth. If I switch the carriage back to N, I can then knit back from hold as I normally would. An important thing to remember when working in hold or working short row shaping or partial knitting, as this is often referred to, is that if you're ever holding groups of needles, so 2 or more, those needles must be held opposite the side of the carriage. In this first example, I've held needles on the same side of the carriage when I begin knitting a row, and it carries a float across those needles, which I don't want. So here I'm ripping back those needles beyond those that I left in work out, so I can free pass then using the hold function back to the other side and eliminate that float that I created. So the proper way to put needles in hold is to put those groups in hold opposite the carriage. So here the carriage is on the left, I'm holding a group of needles on the right, and when I knit across from left to right, the working yarn ends and slips over those held needles so that when I knit back, it ignores them again. I have to knit back to the left before I can hold another group of needles on the right hand side again, because this has to occur opposite the side of the carriage. So essentially what's happening here is that a new selvage stitch is forming on the new edgemost stitch. I'm going to continue holding groups of 5 needles every alternate row on the side opposite the carriage until I work my way across the knitting. Essentially what's happening is I'm knitting a slope. So all of the needles in work on the left-hand side are knitting more rows than they are on the right-hand side because I continue to decrease, in a sense, the number of needles in work on the right. After I've held across the row, I can switch from H to N and knit back from hold, kind of finalizing this step in the process. I'm going to knit a couple more rows just to put some distance between what's currently in the hooks of the needle so you can see that there'll be a little eyelet or a hole where those groups of needles are separated. You can avoid this 2 ways, and I'll demonstrate them both in this video. The first is by wrapping. So I'm again going to hold groups of 5 needles, but when I knit to the right, I'm going to wrap under the last needle and hold before I knit back. This will form an extra loop, but it'll help close that gap or that eyelet. Produces a little bit of a cleaner finish. So now that my carriage is on the left, I'll hold 5 more stitches on the right, knit across, wrap the last needle held, knit back, and I'll continue to repeat this all the way across. I realize that I don't have a multiple of 5 that I'm knitting across, so there's always like 7 stitches left in the last group. This is a demo, it doesn't matter, but sometimes it is nice when those even groupings work out a bit. So last time I switched the carriage to N to knit back, but this time instead I'm going to push the needles to forward work and leave the carriage in hold and knit across. And again, for this sample, I'm just knitting a couple rows so I can show you what the wrap does to that gap. So you can see it's closed up a bit, and from the knit side, it's far less noticeable. The second option to closing this gap is an automatic wrap. It's easy, but takes a little bit more sorting out. So again, if I'm working those same groups of 5, first I'm only going to pull out 4, knit across, and then instead of wrapping, I'm going to pull out the last needle and push that into hold, which is essentially going to wrap the yarn across it when I knit back to the other side. This seemingly breaks the rule of putting needles in hold on the carriage side of the work, but because it's only a single needle, I can get away with it. You can always hold needles on either side of the carriage if you're only holding one at a time. Any more than one, so 2 or more needles in a given group, must be held on the side opposite the carriage or you'll have floats everywhere. It looks similar, but not exactly like the wrapped needle. So a little bit of context or using short row shaping in practice. I think the clearest example is probably shaping a shoulder slope. So in preparation, I'm binding off, let's say this is the center front edge on the left of a cardigan, binding off a couple stitches at the center front neck, and then I'll decrease a few up the neckline just so that you can see a little bit of a garment shape taking form as I get to the shoulder slope and then perform the shaping. So at this point, I'm ready to start shaping the shoulder. So I'm going to pull out on the armhole end 3 needles, knit across, wrap, knit back. Hold 3 opposite the carriage, knit across, wrap, knit back. This is a sample I kind of made up on the fly. This isn't a real pattern. I guess it could be, but I purposely chose a shoulder that was multiples of 3, so it ended up 3 nicely. But sometimes it doesn't always work out that way. You might have to do a little bit of calculating. So I like to knit one more row across all the needles to clean up some of those wrapped needles that carry 2 floats before I bind off. It's certainly up to you. I think they'll both produce a clean finished seam when you join the front and back shoulder together, but maybe a habit I picked up along the way. So here I'm going to use the latch tool method and bind off around the gate pegs and then take it off the machine, and you'll be able to see the shoulder slope quite clearly and a good example of short row shaping or partial knitting and work.